Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Lawless, Manager of Live Content for the US and Canada at AVIXA, and welcome to Reimagining Audio and Acoustics for Sports Venues, brought to you by our sponsors, Yamaha Unified Communications and Kramer. I'm being joined today by ARUP's Senior Consultant, Willem Boning, and ARUP's Associate Principal, Elizabeth Valmont, as well as Sonic Design Sound Designer, Daniel Gearhart, and Sonic Design's Associate Sound Designer, Ellen Fitton. Our moderator for today is Kirsten Nelson, AVIXA's content producer. Before I hand over the presentation to Kirsten, there are a few housekeeping items. For those viewing live, today's webinar qualifies for 1 CTS, CTSD, 1 CTSI, RU credit. Please allow 5 to 7 business days to view on your transcripts, and for any issues, email webinars@avixa.org. You will have access to this recorded webinar at avixa.org/webinars within about 5 business days. And last, the webinar will be approximately 45 to 60 minutes, and all attendees will be placed on mute. If you have any questions during the presentation, please enter them into the Q&A window so today's presenters can address them throughout the webinar and towards the end. To access the Q&A window, simply move your cursor to the bottom of the live stream video box and locate the Q&A icon and type away. And now, Kirsten, over to you.
Right. Well, thank you so much. So glad to be here to talk about this exciting topic today. Thanks, Kate, for the intro. Yeah, welcome everyone. I am so glad to have these particular guests on this topic. Definitely people who are working at the forefront of trying to make sure that sports sounds and feels as good as we can get it right now in this time of empty stadiums and social distancing. So we're talking with a group here today that has dealt with stuff kind of globally and is paying attention globally to how things are reopening and how things are being reimagined very much real time right now. There's a lot that's changing even as we speak. With every single game, there's some correction that can be made. So this will be a fun topic for sure. This all began because of an article that ARUP posted, and we have 2 of the authors of that paper today. I'm excited to address this, and I'm going to drop it into the chat, the article that in question. But it basically was an article that had the headline, "And the crowd goes silent?" ? Because honestly, that's what we started to realize. Like it's not just the audience and the broadcasters that are dissatisfied with hollow, empty stadiums. The actual athletes are not inspired, and they feel like they can't play to their level when it is dead silent. So I'm really glad to have everyone here. I guess with that, I'll just jump right in and say that, throw this over to Willem and Lizzie from ARUP, who were authors of this paper. Let's dive right in and say kind of why did you end up working on that particular article at this time, pulling together the historical aspects of stadiums and sports and the crowd sound and atmosphere, and all the way up to the present to today, trying to recreate that. I think we'll start with Willem.
Thanks, Kristen, and I'm really glad to be here. I feel very honored to be talking with Dan and Ellen also. One of the things that I've been doing a lot of work at ARUP over the past few years has been finding new ways of simulating crowd noise, not just in sports, but in transport hubs, in open plan offices, and museum atriums, and discovering how much the kind of local culture of that office or train station or what have you matters for a sense of realism and for a sense of achieving a sense of place for what may be very mundane architectural decision making, actually. How much sound absorbing finish do you apply? So I was working on a lot of that, and I'm also a big tennis fan, and my background to start off is Arthur Ashe Stadium, and some of the most kind of sublime and cathartic moments I've had have been at that stadium, being with crowds in moments that, you know, truly can't be reproduced in a way or faked. And so when the lockdown happened and all of the leagues initially shut down, I began wondering, you know, what's going to happen when the stadiums open back up. And surely leagues can't just proceed without any sense of atmosphere at all. And having done a bit of work on this in similar sectors or in other sectors, and seeing some of the challenges of how to create that realism, um, began kind of investigating the experiments that were happening. And then I linked up with Lizzie, and maybe I can hand it over to my colleague Lizzie, who had done a lot of work in the sports sector. And I'll let you introduce how we got involved in it together.
Yeah, so as acoustic consultants, we do believe in that acoustics is an integral part of the experience, sort of what Willem was alluding to. And so we started working as of 2012, actually thinking about this. And it started with actually the Coliseum that's behind me here in LA. And, you know, what we were thinking about was how we could tune the architecture to engage a greater atmosphere for the players and the spectators. And so the study began then, just looking at how the acoustics of the architecture would impact that virtual sort of crowd atmosphere feel. You know, and so it's because we believe acoustics is so important to that experience for everyone. And, you know, we work in other sectors at AirUp, in museums and train stations, in healthcare, and that soundscape is important respectively to the context, certainly of that space. So, you know, in sports, it's the same. So when you remove the fans, now that we're in a COVID sort of new normal, what does that mean? And how can we make it an authentic experience without them? So that's kind of the conundrum and why the article was written. So we started from a place of knowing how important it is and how, you know, the architecture is important about it, and how important the architecture can impact and tune that stadium. But now at this point, it's a little bit of a different ballgame of how do we still get that authenticity, but without the fans.
And that's where we get into the fun part too of what Dan and Ellen have been working on. So yeah, AirUp comes at it from the venue side, and I think it's kind of fun to think about, you know, as an industry, AV and acoustics, we've always known they're vital to sporting atmosphere, but now the fans are starting to get a taste of just how vital this work is, because without fans, it sounds ridiculous. So Dan and Ellen, you guys want to talk about how you got involved in trying to recreate the atmosphere that's missing right now?
Yeah, we got a call from Firehouse Productions. Mark Dipmore had what I like to call an audacious idea, which was his idea was basically that it really mattered, not just to the broadcast, but that what was going to matter was the players themselves. And he wanted to create a basically a soundscape that actually duplicated a game. So the idea was he hung line arrays ringing the court, and then now that these were available, the original material content we had was NBA 2K from their video game. But we realized quickly that this wasn't. Not only was a lot of the material contaminated, meaning we couldn't have sneaker squeaks while people were standing around at the foul line, but it wasn't. It might have worked for a video game, but it didn't really add enough nuance if you were looking at a game, and we had a lot of recordings of games. So I was charged, and Ellen and I worked on this. We were charged with basically creating that soundscape, and we got a lot of the games from NBA. I mean, I had years ago watched basketball avidly, but fallen away from it, and the game has changed radically. So the NBA guys were tremendously helpful. They gave us maybe a dozen games, and we watched them, and watch them and realize what the nuances were about how the crowd responded. And the NBA guys also told us about the narrative of the game and what the game meant and all that kind of stuff. And so we created these textures that could cascade one on top of the other and create many levels of not only what the ambience was, what the reactions were, but also a third level was what the anticipations were prior to the reaction. So, and then this was played by two people. That was the execution. It was two operators, and one guy basically, we switched them around. At first they were one team and the other team, and we decided it had to be like a music bed, and then reactions were something very different. And that's kind of how we approached it. And we sourced and made, hundreds of files that had to be addressed, each one. And eventually when we got on site, we heard it on the court. And we quickly realized, where we had made some errors, what worked, what didn't work. And then I think I had a week in lockdown or something. I mean, so basically there was nothing to do but sit in your room for 12 hours and work and be at a workstation. So, but that was kind of, that was the origin of it. And of course I stayed through them opening into maybe this first or second week, making alterations. And in fact, just yesterday, I delivered more files, which are alterations for the playoffs. So, so it remains a work in progress, but it was, Ellen, what would you like to?
Well, I was going to say maybe just to give the audience a little context. I mean, when the lockdown sort of first happened, there was a lot of discussion, because we consult for NBA stuff. We also consult for NFL games, and there was a lot of talk initially, like, oh no, we couldn't possibly put any artificial crowd. The mixers were very, very adamant that, oh, this is, an historical thing that they're doing. They're recording history, and if there's nobody in the stands, then there shouldn't be any audience, on air. And myself and a couple of others were sort of scratching our heads during this. It's like, okay, but as time evolved and, we got closer and closer to being able to even do broadcasts and teams were actually playing, then, all these concerns started to come up. It's like, well, how does that affect the fan experience? How does that affect the player experience? A big concern was about communication between the coaches and the players and how much of that gets covered up by the fans. And now suddenly all of that is exposed. And what does that do to all their strategies? So there was a lot of stuff that sort of started to come into play as we got closer and closer. And then all of a sudden we're getting these calls. Oh my God, we need content. We need content, and it needs to sound real. And we spent days and days and days first listening to games and getting a sense of how Dan was saying, the arc of a game and what's the narrative of the game. And football is different than basketball, is different than hockey. But primarily we've been tasked with the content for this NBA. And, I can't tell you how many cheers and boos and oohs and ahs I've listened to for hours on end, really getting into the nuance of, well, this will work and this won't, and why won't this work? And I remember one particular day I was struggling just because there was a mandate to come up with a certain number of ahs, and all I could find were oohs or a boo. Like I just couldn't get the level of ahs that it seemed that the client wanted. And finally, Dan and I are studying these things, and there was an epiphany, and it's like, it's not the syllable per se. It's not ah or aw. It's the intent. Does it arc up? Does it arc down? Is it a positive reaction of excitement, or is it a negative reaction of disappointment? And then suddenly it's like that was sort of transformational for me.
Suddenly you said, ah.
Exactly. And then I knew I was like not looking for, I didn't have to find per se. What I needed was to find that intent in whatever verbiage it was that the crowd used in that particular, whether I was sourcing from a different sport or was sourcing from different arenas or Foley or whatever it was. There's a whole collection of things that we use to create these beds and these reactions for NBA, but you start to think and analyze in a way that you didn't think that you, in a level of detail that you didn't think you would ever be going there.
Yeah, the emotional piece of this is really interesting. And I think the emotional connection to venues, particular traditions and venues, and that's a lot of what you were experimenting with at AirUp too, right? You had to do you've done a lot of measurements over the years of how different venues have very distinct sounds that people can recognize. And that's something else that's playing into this, right? Is trying to make sure that when people are hearing things, even if they're not there, they're going to know what it sounds like if it's really at their home. If they can recognize that, right? Is that what you found?
Yeah, I think that it's an interesting word, intent. It's a powerful word because, some of the intent when we were looking at this in the natural setting, when there were spectators in the stands and they get to cheer or boo however they like based on their demographic or based on number and based on the game. The intent sometimes was about a home field advantage, and that was a natural, organic thing. I mean, when I mentioned earlier that the architecture can be tuned, you think about some of the more popular stadiums like Seattle Seahawks Stadium, and, there's certainly a well-known home field advantage for them because of their architecture, having a louder stadium and sense of excitement. When you remove these spectators, the source of that noise, of that atmosphere, are we trying to replicate that same intent? That's sort of how we were like deconstructing the article a bit. It's thinking about these layers, and I think that's a really important point Ellen makes about the intent, because it's, what is the intent for every part of the game? There's so much nuance. So totally agreed. So it's so interesting, right, what you're doing with the NBA.
And there's also the element of intent with, so as we're repurposing some of these venues for these crowdless games, part of what AirUp has gotten involved in, and a few AV firms have had to run in and do, is reposition the PA, because the PA is aimed out at, but now suddenly there's a requirement to try to get a little bit of the sound onto the field so the players feel like something's happening. And then I guess what I'm interested in here is it seems like they started gradually figuring out, not only do we need something that makes this place feel live for the players, we also need to have something that's masking what's happening on the field, not only for the broadcast mix. There's a lot of very colorful expressions that are used during games. They're trying to mask those out before it gets to broadcast, and also just trying to protect the coaches and trying to keep the actual plays private. So I guess, I don't know, there's been a sort of quick reconfiguration there too, right? Of trying to make sure the PA system, even loading in new PA to try to make sure that stuff can be aimed differently right now.
Right. Well, that's part of what was so interesting about this. And when they came to us about NBA, is they were putting this whole system in geared specifically towards the players. MLB initially started out with just using the stadium PA, which of course is faced the wrong way. And to my knowledge, they haven't changed that yet. They are moving from more just ambience beds. I think they are now incorporating reactions, where initially they just were looking for an ambience. But NBA in particular was, okay, we want this faced at the players. So that's a different kind of perspective, and there was a lot of concern, again, not just about the communication, but foul language and things like that as well. And that's also very, very touchy with NFL, which is sort of just kicked off and just getting their legs in terms of how they're handling that as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you know, how quickly we called it the toughest layers were the bottom layers. They were the ambient loops that became what everything was built upon. And the very first loop, we decided fast we would never turn off. That was just it was like 20 minutes long, so you couldn't identify, you wouldn't necessarily remember what you had heard. But that loop, we just left running the whole time. And now and then somebody would come to us and say, you know, I don't hear any audio going. And when we'd shut it off, they'd just be so startled, like, what? No, oh, okay, turn that back on. But we decided we had to leave it running all the time because we didn't want anybody identifying. Like, you wanted them to marinate in it. You know, this is what the arena sounds like. And of course, it's made up, but it was really effective. You could really, and I like to say by the end of the process, of course, we know a lot of things we might do differently for the next iteration. But by the end of the process, I remember being on the court one night in first week of August and actually thinking that even though I knew all the stuff, I could recognize what I heard, but I was believing it anyway. It was believable, but it had to be really densely populated with multiple textures. You couldn't just, it wasn't just like a cartoon. It wasn't like there was a reaction. There just had to be a setup to the reaction, and it was associated with whatever bed you were in. It was like, it got complicated, but it was the only way to keep it believable, you know.
Sounds like it's a show production too, because from what you've mentioned before about starting that ambient sound bed 90 minutes before, before the players come anywhere near that court, that ambient, that feeling of maybe the crowd is actually gradually filling in. It's just building, right? And then there's an arc you're going for.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it really is a production. I don't know how much people know about the detail of NBA, but there are two audio sweeteners, and one is sort of responsible for the ambient bed and how that ramps up and down during the course of the game, and that's kind of a painting unto itself. And then there's another sweetener who's responsible for the reactionary stuff, whether it's cheers or, and levels of cheers and things like that. And there was a real concern among them in the beginning about negative reaction and boos. And as an engineer, not wanting to be responsible, because again, there's a narrative to the game, and the engineers didn't want to be responsible for taking that narrative, the illusion that they're taking a side. They didn't want that. So there is, in fact, a game producer, and there's someone who decides, is this a negative thing? Are we putting out a negative reaction to the players and to the audience at home about what's happening?
Yeah, mostly they didn't do many negative reactions, but the only reactions that are actually triggered that are negative are triggered by someone from the NBA. So if it's, let's say it's a chant calling airball, the away team misses the basket entirely and the crowd starts to say airball, our sweeteners would not be triggering that. They're like neutral. So they're only positive.
This is a question for us as well, which is that we began our process of doing research and writing the article purely out of nostalgia for all of the warm, wonderful stuff that we missed about crowd noise. But we also started thinking about, are there aspects of crowd noise that we might not want to add back into the mix? And beyond that, when we reopen and we have crowds coming back, could we attempt to shift the culture a bit? There are many examples of this, but I'm even thinking of that first game I went to in Flushing Meadows when the crowd was roaring with boos at the end, and it was distracting to both Serena and Naomi, and it kind of stole Naomi Osaka's first Grand Slam moment. And they didn't show it on TV, but she had to go walk down the court, and she just stood facing the wall until the boos died down. And when she won against Azarenka the other day, she got to you know, without the crowd there, she got to lay on the court and look up at the stars and enjoy all of that stuff she couldn't do because the crowd was raining down boos before. So I think that's one example. We also see examples of racist taunting that happen in certain leagues. I'm more aware of it in Europe than the US, but that's the sort of stuff that you can't control with a live crowd. But now we face that choice, and we do have that control.
And we're actually designing the atmosphere, and we're trying to, it seems like what we're going to do with this too is have a greater understanding of what is compelling. And in fact, we have a question that actually I think plays into what we talked about with some of the, sorry, someone's using a chainsaw in my backyard right now, by the way, so I apologize. But yeah, basically we were talking about some of the things that are going to be lasting impact of these new designs and this new way of thinking of sports venues. And Willem, you talked a little bit about how even before all of this, a lot of sports clients were looking for ways to have a venue be able to host different sizes and capacities of crowds, being able to address and welcome other events and demographics into a space, either by physical change or acoustic adjustment, to make the bowl still feel intimate when it's got a smaller capacity. And then, yeah, we have a question that came in that was about, is there any effort in augmenting smaller crowds? So yeah, is there anything we're doing right now in terms of the smaller crowds that are allowed in certain venues? And do you see a sort of long-term effect of trying to create a cozier feeling even when there's less people there?
Well, I would say one of the troubles with a smaller crowd, and especially because they're a socially distant crowd, the thing about crowd is it's mass. It's sound being put out by a mass of people. So when you have everybody spread out like that, the impact to what you're hearing in the stadium is fairly insignificant. So, I mean, to answer the question, does it really, it doesn't impact what we're doing. We're trying to create the sense of a full arena or a full stadium. If there happen to be a few people there, sure, that's an added bonus. It adds a randomness to what's happening. But again, it can't, 2 or 3 people sitting, in this section and 2 or 3 people in another section. It's not enough mass really to sort of, to use the term augmenting it. It's not impactful enough to the size of the space to really to affect what we're doing.
I think even beyond the size of the crowd or the capacity, I think what you discovered, Lizzie, on your tour of stadiums is that the architecture, even just the pitch of the stadium, can have a huge impact on the identity of that noise. But I'll let you speak more to that.
I mean, as far as the architecture goes, there were attributes of the architecture that would help provide a greater loudness, atmosphere. So yeah, exactly, Willem, like some of that might be a steeper rake. Some of that might be placing things like a canopy, like you see in Seattle Seahawks again, where you can redirect sound back to the field, to the stands. There might be balconies with or VIP suites, let's say, as part of the architecture of that stadium that allows you to have a vertical panel, if you will, that can also redirect sound. So there's different things that can be done to the architecture to augment, if using that word again, the noise in the stadium. Artificially, you can do that, with virtually, digitally, with an amplified system. I think the one thing to caution though is, again, back to realism and authenticity. If a stadium's only 30,000 versus, a 90,000, we have to be careful of how we decide to design that sound. But yeah, in terms of the work we've done, it was looking at the natural architecture of these venues and how they might shape that acoustic. And this isn't mind-blowing stuff. We do this for concert halls. We do this for opera houses. We do this for venues that have people in them, right? And that are trying to showcase a certain bit of entertainment, right? So, so it's just taking those, you know, first principle concepts and just applying them to our sports venues.
Yeah, and then we get into the ideas of the specifics of those venues that people expect, and some of the traditions and chants and things that are familiar to that particular space. And we actually had a question about that too, about, and I think that Dan and Ellen, you had to deal with this a little bit, or I think that various leagues and various teams are trying to address bringing in those unique fan responses from certain venues and certain teams. And we had a question come in about that, about adding back in traditional fan responses at home stadiums. Question from Anne, where she said it was weird watching the Broncos game on Monday night and hearing the PA announcer say that the ruling on the field is, and not hearing any fan response, incomplete. So I guess there's some of that too. As we design, literally create sound designs, much like we would for a show, trying to pull in and making sure we're pulling some of those pieces of what people expect for that particular venue or team, right?
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting thing going to what Lizzie was talking about. There's another aspect to the crowd, to the reactions that I thought of, because I was working on the NFL game last week, and a set of them. And one of the things about crowd sound, I think it's almost, think of like if you're watching a sitcom, the purpose of the laugh track is not merely, it's not really a cue. The purpose of the laughter, and even if it's a live audience, even better, like something like Cheers, where they actually mic'd the hell out of that audience. This is years ago. And it's a very complex design they had, but the purpose of it is to allow the home viewer permission to laugh. Like, one of the things that made Curb Your Enthusiasm so insanely funny, but also awkward, is that there was no laugh track. And it was purposely, it was part of its discomfort level, there was a little bit of music maybe to tell you that it was an awkward moment, but the show itself was specifically trying to, like, it was a different evocation, but the purpose of a live audience, allowing that laughter to be part of the show, is to allow the viewer at home to feel comfortable sitting in their living room laughing out loud at a television set. And so go to the crowd now, like you're watching a game. Without the crowd as part of the game, if you were just watching the game at home and it's just two teams facing each other, it becomes very difficult to get really to let go emotionally. Like, I'm sure we've all been to parties or something, and there are some people who watch these games and they'll be yelling at the TV set. Would they be doing that if there was no sound coming from the TV set? I don't know.
I love your idea, Dan, about being given permission in a way. Yeah. The second match I went to at Arthur Ashe was between Naomi Osaka and Coco Gauff in this highly anticipated match. And at the very end of the game, Osaka won, but she invited Coco Gauff to do the winner's interview on court with her, which is unprecedented in tennis. And it went against the kind of interviewer's setup. And the crowd fell absolutely silent. And partway through, I felt a tear running down my cheek. And I looked around and everyone else was crying. It was, and there's something, I felt very sheepish and about that reaction, and a bit embarrassed. But then when I looked around and saw everyone else in the stadium was completely still, listening, and was also like their faces wet with tears. It was, it was a good feeling. It turned from an awkward feeling into a good feeling, and having that permission, as you say, is a really beautiful way of saying it, rather than the kind of sort of mob mentality that sometimes crowds are spoken of in terms of
Yeah, well, sports is theater, right? It is a group catharsis, and the best thing about it is that one of my cousins told me this one time. It's theater that we actually don't know the ending to. We don't have the usual cues. You know, we might have a guess, but it's genuinely true emotion, group catharsis, sharing that together. And in fact, we had a question that kind of pertains to that too. And I think this actually has a technical answer that we might all be able to answer kind of quickly. But someone was asking, does every sports league, is there any thought of pulling in, yeah, like either having fans interact? And I think a few different teams and leagues have done this, where you can have an app where people at home can react in real time. And has there been any way to try to pull in real time crowd responses? This person actually suggested outfitting sports bars with microphones and bridging in true fan reactions. But I think we all know, right? Like latency, right? That's the problem.
Yeah, we tried it. Alan can speak to this too, but we had a Microsoft Teams. We had screens on one entire side of the court, a video wall. And there were like, I don't know, a couple hundred tiles that were available, and they populated them with people who could get on and watch the game from home. And so the first problem was there were a lot of people who didn't have even a headset or something, and so that became an audio pickup problem because they were. But the second problem, obviously, as you mentioned, is latency, and Microsoft was working on it. I think they thought they'd get close. My understanding is they didn't get close enough, so there was no audio from it. You'd see their reactions, and it was usually a little late, you know, but it's an interesting idea. Like if you could, you know, pipe that into the arena as well, would be kind of cool if you could get
Lizzie
that
and
going.
I actually joined, I think, the very first experiment that was done, which was Zoom partnering with a team in the Danish Superliga soccer team. And it was such a fascinating experience. It was done by Zoom, and we joined a block of fans in the stands. I think, Lizzie, you were probably in a different section than I was. And you're teleported into the living rooms, basically, of hundreds of Danish people who are fans. And it was quite, you know, there were issues, similarly to what you bring up, Dan, but to me it was memorable because you really see the depth and breadth of the fandom in a way that's much more intimate than you might if they're in the stadium. You see cats and houseplants and kids running around. And while it may have not been perfect, I think there is a kind of new sense of community that must have came out of that, even though I think it was done as a one-off, the same way that all of us have our home Zoom backgrounds on and you know, are kind of negotiating this new kind of intimacy in our communities that, again, I think goes to the question of what is an authentic fan culture and how do you take advantage of this moment to engage fans in a new way.
Yeah, I'm there's a oh, sorry, Ellen, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
It was just really quick. I mean, to the question also about apps. I know that there's apps being developed out there. I want to say Yamaha is one of them, and I think they tested it in Japan, where you would download the app and you had, you know, as a user, you had options to how you wanted to engage, and they had algorithms where they can have sound like cheers and things that you can actually feed in, and you should be able to hear it on the other end, what you decided to play. Now, I think they have their algorithms to control the hundreds or thousands of people that are probably feeding in that noise, but it's an enabler, and it's, you know, I like what Dan said about how do you make, you know, the users feel comfortable at home, the spectators feel comfortable at home. I think comfort's a big one, but in this case, it's also how else do we entertain, new forms of entertainment so that you feel immersed, you feel engaged, and that's your new comfort too. So I think there's a lot of promise in with apps in the future too, being developed to get there.
Yeah, and I was just going to add one of the things that maybe we see if this goes on for a long time, which I hope it doesn't, is, as we developed apps and stuff, but I think that's the technology, that's a big mountain to climb. But also we may get into sort of curating even more team specific, not, above and beyond cheers. It's a specific chant that the Lakers always have at their home stadium, or that the Jets always have at their stadium, getting into really specific things for each venue or each team, which did sort of, that discussion came up a little bit as we were sort of winding down the creation of our content for NBA. But that's also a huge undertaking. That's a big time intensive. Well, we need a library of things for this team and a library of teams for that thing, and then somebody has to know the appropriate time to cue it and all that. So, I mean, it could go that way if we're locked down for a long time, if people really want to get even more and more genuine to the specific games. But it's, you run out of time, you run out of money, you run out of resource to create these things. But I could see where that might be an option to somebody at home on their couch who's 5 seconds late, or his pickup in his house isn't good. So there's a couple of ways, I guess, that you could cover that scenario.
I'm kind of interested in something, Wilhelm, you said earlier, and so this idea of, and you alluded to it about theaters maybe, so years ago I was involved with a production, and it was Jaffe Associates at that time, and they had this ERAS system that they had, created the impression of a lower ceiling. This was the idea, and they put mics over the stage. But going to what you and Lizzie were talking about the stadiums, is there a thought that that you could use a bed or something in the stadiums distributed around if the stadium were only half occupied, or maybe the stadium's 1/3 occupied? Is there a thought that there's something that's piped into the stadium or the venue size that gives you the impression of different sizes? Obviously you can't, but this is the idea in the hall thing, was they were actually creating the impression of a different size hall based upon what they wanted it to sound like.
I think it's really a question of expectation, which I think you brought up, or Ellen, maybe you brought up. And sometimes your expectations, you can be surprised, and it's a good feeling. I remember, talking about theaters and concert halls. I went to a concert of chamber music, just a clarinet and a violinist and someone with a big bass drum actually on stage in an opera house. And they limited the admission to maybe 50 people in this opera house that sat maybe 2,000. And it sounded incredible. You don't normally hear small music like that in a big space. But the program that was chosen was this very Spartan, modern atonal classical music. And it really fit somehow that unusual venue. On the other hand, I think a journalist in The Guardian was writing about this in the Premier League, that there are some teams that just don't have good turnout, and their super fans don't care, and they just like scream as one pack. And I think if you were to add a bed, they might feel a bit a bit offended that they're not, the super fans, are not good enough for their team. So I think it's exciting to think that those expectations can not always be met, and that you don't always have this neutral, consistent fan experience. But at the same time, now that we have to address these questions of fairness, we had in the NBA, you've had to invent home and away teams. where there are no home and away fans, it's worth thinking about, you know, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to upset people's expectations if it adds something new and exciting and helps engage more people.
Yeah, because I was thinking of what Ellen had said about the mass. In other words, if you're socially distanced and you're sitting there like, 10 feet apart from the next person, 10 feet apart from the next person, going back to this idea of permission to let go. If your sense is that you're out there by yourself and you can be heard by yourself in the stand, that's a little bit intimidating. It's not like you're shoulder to shoulder with a whole bunch of other people and everybody's audible and everybody's heard. I just wonder if there's not something to be said for, there's something even at the fan experience level in a stadium which is now maybe populated by 20% of what it could do. Is there not some, again, I go back to the laugh track an audience, so mic'd audience, but that gives you permission at home to be more participatory, whereas maybe in the stadium,
We've seen this in the past 5 or so years. There's been an explosion of companies moving into very large volume offices, going from your traditional 9-foot ceiling to post-industrial renovations, new builds, what have you. And as we've started designing those spaces and working with architects and visiting spaces that have already been built, we've seen how much people adjust their behavior based on how quiet, how much background babble there is in this space. There's a space in Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York that we went and visited, and we noticed as soon as we went in that we lowered our voices. And we're still trying to figure out exactly why we do that and why everyone who enters that space does that. But I think it absolutely has to do with your perception of other people, and not just other people as this generic category, but other people who are near you and other people who are far from you and other people as a sort of mass of people in the space. And I think we've all been realizing in this moment where we've been removed from those spaces, how sensitive we are and how much we act based on that sensitivity. It's the same in our cities as well, that everything is quieted down. And in our homes, we may, partners are working out of the same studio apartments. And I think we're all beginning to realize that there is a sort of fine psychology that we've taken for granted, that now, as you say, Dan, when things begin to gradually reopen, and I think we're going to start to see that in the NFL, that we want to give people permission, right? That's the point. We want to give people permission to feel and emote.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we want people to enjoy the game. We want people to tune in, and watch. And so whatever we can do to make them feel normal, because so much of what we're experiencing now isn't normal. So.
And there'll be some trial. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just saying we're trying to bring a little slice of normal back to everybody as best we can.
I was just going to say to that end that there will probably be a little bit of trial and error, right? So to Dan's point earlier, there is in the past precedent and systems right now that exist that can change the reverberation time and other acoustic parameters for a given fixed hall or a venue, and they could simulate it to be smaller or larger based on how they digitally change it. And there's possibilities for these sports venues to do something similar. But to your point, if you're the only person standing in the stand, is it going to be eerie? So or does it actually make you feel at home, because that's the way the sounds were since the beginning. So I think a trial and error will probably be part of the ingredients here for success.
think that was interesting too about what Dan and Ellen, you were saying about the bubble and the sounds, the actual installed sound system. They created basically a 10.1 sound system for the venues. You know, each of the three NBA bubble venues have the same setup for truly immersive feeling, primarily for the players to feel comfortable. There is a PA that faces the scattered audience of the other COVID tested people who live in the bubble. But I think that you guys had mentioned that you actually purposely kind of, well, the sound designers were telling me this too, the system designers, that they purposely messed up the system a little bit. So it was actually a little more human sounding. So it wasn't just perfect stereo replicated, like perfection on the court. It was a little bit jostled. But you had mentioned that sometimes you have some certain clusters light up with certain fan responses, just like it might in a real game. You know, it's not everyone always simultaneously having the same reaction. Sometimes it begins over here and then ripples. Was that part of your design process too, was having those little clusters?
Yeah, we had, there were small chants that would start. And when that would happen, we had basically a randomized folder. And we might say, okay, this particular chant is small enough that it would make no sense that it came out of 10 speakers, because you can tell it's like 50 or 60 people. That's all it is. So it had to really, we had to be able to source it to like one, you know, maybe two speakers, two arrays. And that would be from where, and then if it needed to grow, it could grow into the whole thing with a follow-on, you know, chant. But we didn't view it as like everything came out of everything. It had to move around, because otherwise you read it as fake. You know, it just didn't make any sense. So you really had to pursue details like that. There were a ton of little details that was one of them where we would discover, you know, I think I mentioned the other day was the first thing we noticed when we cascaded all of these layers on top of each other was that the room got bigger. It sounded like the room got bigger, which made no sense. But I realized, it's about the low end. So I can't stack all these effects and have it sound like the room is ballooning out. What has to happen is the crowd has to get denser. Their response has to be more dense. So yeah, these were the things and it was funny, that was actually, we were standing on the court one night and I heard that happen and I realized, I get it, but what's driving this, you know? And I hadn't heard it on my near field monitors. I hadn't heard it that way because I was completely accepting on my near field. So I was like, this is fine. But it's interesting. There are a whole lot of little details like that we would stumble across as we worked on it. And then it was actually, you know, having never done anything like this, I found it like really, really intriguing. It was just so engaging, you know.
One of the things that we found, Dan, if I can go back to this very mundane task of deciding how much sound absorbing finish do you want to have in a train station concourse or something, you know,
Mm-hmm.
Was we started simulating these spaces with just background babble noise, because that sound absorbing finish doesn't affect the sound of people who are near you. It's such a big space that you don't hear them in the mix. And we realized that if the space was quite big and reverberant, it didn't sound like anything. It just sounded like white noise or pink noise. It had no sense of scale, no sense of architecture whatsoever, although that's all we cared about really was that background babble and how loud or quiet it was. And then we realized even if we just added in one person talking or walking across the soundstage, so to speak, suddenly we had this sense of scale. It was like we understood, this is an enormous space. And we went through, as I think you did as well, the series of discoveries of the things that give the scale to people. Another thing we discovered is that in transit concourses, if you don't have any motion, that also doesn't give you a sense of scale. So we needed to figure out how to program people walking in different types of shoes. And the shoes that give you the best sense of scale are really hard-soled shoes and high heels, because they create the really high, and this is becoming really nerdy now, but I know there are people on the call who might enjoy this. When you have really high frequency sounds, the tick, 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 tick of high heels, the reverberation breaks through the babble noise, which is this mid-frequency, gray, white, pink noise, whatever you want to call it. The other thing we noticed in Grand Central is the thing that gave us a sense of scale was the tinkling of glassware and flatware at the Michael Jordan Grill, which is one of the two restaurants inside it, because that's the only sound, aside from footsteps, that you hear the direct sound from, the sound coming straight from that impact noise, and also reverberating in the space. And that's how you know how large Grand Central is by listening, is by someone dropping their fork on their plate. And we would have never thought of adding that to the simulation until we heard it in our field recording and was like, wow, this is what makes Grand Central feel so grand.
Yeah.
Those specifics that really help tell the story. And I think we've seen that on all these sports simulations as well. And we had a question that I do want to get to before we wrap up. But yeah, someone was asking about in the bubble, whether, it's about the defense chant. And I know you guys had talked a little bit about this, about how you end up making that work. But the question was, is the home team's production crew controlling the sound? And yeah, I think you had talked a little bit about who's operating that particular.
Yeah, so the defense, so we realized that we had to, usually there's a DJ who does the prompt, we call it. So the prompt is like, da-da, ba-da, right? And the crowd knows to go defense. So we realized, okay, we have to marry these together. But, and also when we made them, we have to make them a little bit sloppy, because you can't just have it be rhythmic, because the crowd is going to be sloppy. So that was like a struggle to.
That was a big struggle for us as both
Yeah.
classically trained musicians. We were like, we want everyone to cheer in time. And
Yeah,
I did a whole set of them, and Dan came back to me and said, no, that doesn't work. It's too in time.
Said, yeah, Ellen, you don't understand. These people are all drinking, and they're not responding just like that. They're not doing it. So, but no, we left. So to answer your question, we left that with the DJ. We actually had a separate rig so that he could cue. And the only thing that started to be kind of funny, we realized, was there was I kept getting words early on saying like, hey, some of them are just not long enough. And I was like, well, I got the prompts from the DJs, so I just made the crowd noise over the top of their prompts. So since they gave me the prompt, how can they be telling me the prompt isn't long enough? Then we sort of realized, as I went to a couple games where I watched what was happening, and the whole thing changed the behavior of the DJ himself. Because ordinarily in a game, if I went back to some games, the DJ might go ba-da, ba-da, and if the crowd doesn't respond, he knows they're sick of me right now. I'm going to stop, right? But that's not what was happening, because the DJ gets a payback every time, because we've married the crowd to the prompt. You know what I'm saying? So probably we might rethink the way this would be done next time. But yeah, I had to lengthen so some of them are like 22 seconds long, and the shot clock is 24. But because they're getting an instant reaction, because it's already married, they're just, every time out, they were more aggressive with it than maybe they would have, because, as I said, they probably would have gotten a little bit chastened by, oh, I think they're sick of me for a little bit, and maybe I'll do that next time. It's kind of funny though. It's human behavior, even for the operators. Like, how does it affect what you're thinking?
Yeah, they started to believe their own hype that that they were making the crowd that into it, that the crowd didn't want to stop chanting.
They forgot it wasn't a crowd.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure the players really appreciated the extra vivacity of the crowd every time too. So yeah, it's a good thing. It ended up working out for everyone. But yeah, well, I think actually that we are actually wrapping up. We're at our time here. We're at the shot clock is hit it. So yeah, I really want to thank all of you for talking about these topics. I think we have a lot to follow up on. I'm actually writing a story about this for AVIXA, so there's a whole bunch of stuff coming up that people can follow up on, and this session was recorded and you'll be able to get it. So, but first of all, I thank you so much for coming to talk about this with our audience today. I think we had a lot of people that were really interested in this
Great.
topic.
Thanks for having us, Kirsten.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great.
It's a lot of fun.
Bye.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining today's webinar, Reimagining Audio and Acoustics for Sports Venues. This recording will be available on avixa.org/webinars within about 5 to 7 business days. And your 1 RU credit will be applied to your transcript also within 5 to 7 business days. For any trouble, please contact webinars@avixa.org. And a thank you to our sponsors, Yamaha Unified Communications and Kramer. And a huge thank you to Willem, Elizabeth, Daniel, Ellen, and Kirsten for showing us how audio plays a pivotal role in sports venues today. We hope you enjoyed and have a wonderful day, everyone.